Mom, go out somewhere for a while. My friends and I are coming over for a barbecue, said my son on the phone, the same son who had been living in my house for 7 years on my pension. All right, sweetheart, I replied quietly. But when they arrived and saw what I had prepared, they all ran off in a panic. I slowly opened my eyes, listening to the silence of the house. 68 wasn't just a number. It was a lifetime etched into my body and soul. Carefully, I sat up in bed, wincing from the sharp pain in my hip. My morning routine always began the same way. First, feel around for my glasses on the nightstand, then take a sip of water to swallow my arthritis pill, or rather, half a pill. I hadn't been able to afford a full dose for quite some time. 9 years, I thought, glancing at the photo of my husband next to the lamp. 9 years without you, Thomas. In the picture, Thomas was smiling that special smile that had always warmed my heart. I remembered that day in vivid detail, our 40th wedding anniversary, a small celebration in the garden with the kids and grandkids. None of us knew that a month later, Thomas's heart would stop in his sleep, and my world would collapse in an instant. The modest 2-story house that Thomas and I had bought in our youth, paying off the mortgage over more than 20 years, now felt far too big for a lonely elderly woman. Though calling myself lonely was a stretch. I sighed as I heard snoring from the next room, our best bedroom, now occupied by my 35-year-old son, Edward. "Just for a couple of months, Mom," he had said 7 years ago, standing at the door with 2 suitcases. "Just until I get back on my feet." 7 years, 84 months instead of the promised 2. I remembered how happy I'd been back then. After Thomas died, the house had felt so empty, so lifeless. My son's return felt like a blessing, a chance to feel needed again. Foolish old woman. I tiptoed past Edward's room, careful not to wake him. He'd come home well past midnight, slamming the door and muttering something under his breath. He smelled of beer and cigarettes. Nothing unusual, just another Tuesday in the life of my temporarily unemployed son. In the kitchen, I started preparing breakfast for 2, though I knew Edward would likely sleep until noon. My fingers, twisted by arthritis, clumsily cracked the eggs into a bowl. Cooking always calmed me. It gave me a sense of control over at least one small corner of my life. I turned on the radio at the lowest volume and caught the weather forecast. Rain was expected in the afternoon. I'd need to hang the laundry out early or it wouldn't dry, and I had to pick up my pension check from the mailbox. Most of it would go toward bills and groceries. There likely wouldn't be enough left for medicine again. I carefully pulled a worn notebook from the pocket of my robe. I had to plan my budget down to the cent. Here, utilities. Here, 2 weeks' worth of groceries. Here, a bare minimum of medicine. And this line was crossed out. Meet with Eleanor and Margaret. My old friends still met once a month at a little cafe on Main Street, but I had declined 3 times in a row. Not because I didn't want to see them, but because we had an unspoken rule that each of us took turns paying. And this month, I simply couldn't afford it. From the cupboard above the sink, I took down some bright pink wool. Mrs. Parker from across the street had asked for a birthday hat for her granddaughter and promised to pay $15. Not much, but right now, every dollar counted. My hands moved on their own, the knitting needles quietly clicking. Knitting was my only solace and a tiny source of extra income. I had once dreamed of opening my own yarn and knitwear shop, but life had other plans. A loud bang interrupted my thoughts. The needles slipped from my hands as Edward stumbled into the kitchen, rumpled and unshaven. "Mom, got any coffee?" he mumbled, collapsing into a chair. I silently placed a cup of freshly brewed coffee in front of him. Edward didn't thank me. He just buried his face in his phone. "I made an omelet," I said softly, putting a golden omelet with vegetables onto a plate. "I don't want an omelet," Edward grimaced. "Is there anything decent?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had been hearing things like this for 7 years, but they still hurt. I silently opened the fridge, took out the last slice of ham, and placed it in front of him. "What about cheese?" he asked, not even looking up from his phone. We're out of cheese, I replied. I'll buy some on Friday when I get my pension. Edward scoffed but said nothing. As he chewed his sandwich, I gently asked, How's the job search going? You said yesterday you'd call about that supermarket vacancy. Mom, seriously? Edward rolled his eyes. How many times do I have to say it? I'm working on it. It's just not a great time to be looking for a job. Of course, darling, I nodded, turning to the sink so he wouldn't see my face. I just thought... Exactly, Edward interrupted, finishing his sandwich. Don't think about it. I'm an adult. I'll handle it. An adult. I gave a bitter smile as I looked out the window. My adult son lived off me, slept till noon, played video games all day, and regularly brought over noisy friends who emptied the fridge like it was an all-you-can-eat buffet at a fancy hotel. And after every party, I had to rework our already meager budget. Edward's phone rang, cutting through the awkward silence. Hey, man, he perked up. Of course I remember. Yeah, it's all set. I continued slicing vegetables for lunch, trying not to listen, but his next words froze me mid-motion. No problem. The house is all ours. The folks? Nah, Dad's long gone. And my mom... He glanced at me and lowered his voice, but I still heard it. I'll get my mom out of the house for the whole day. After he hung up, Edward got up from the table and came over. I felt his hand on my shoulder and flinched. Mom, he began gently, I have a small favor to ask. I slowly turned around, drying my hands on my apron. From his tone, I already knew what was coming. Another small favor that I couldn't refuse. My friends are coming over tomorrow evening. We want to have a barbecue in the yard. A barbecue? I repeated. But we don't have any meat, Eddie, and I... Don't worry. We'll buy everything ourselves. Edward waved me off. You don't have to do anything. I sighed with relief. Too soon. It's just that... Edward paused. We'd like to hang out, just us guys. You know what I mean? Mom, could you go out for a bit, yeah? He said in that special tone he used when he wanted his way. Meet your friends, see a movie. Think of something. It'd be awkward with you around. I felt a lump rising in my throat. He wanted me out of my own house, just like that. Go out somewhere. As if I had money for a movie or cafe, as if I had a choice. All right, sweetheart, I replied quietly, clenching my fists until my nails dug into my palms. I'll think of something. Edward beamed, kissed me on the cheek, grabbed his jacket, and rushed out the door. The door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the kitchen. I slowly sank into a chair, feeling tears run down my cheeks. Outside, the rain that the forecast had promised had begun to fall. I sat there motionless for what felt like an eternity. And then something inside me clicked. Something finally broke, or perhaps finally fell into place. I straightened my back and wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. I remembered how 9 years ago, Thomas had taken me to a restaurant for our last anniversary. How he held my hand across the table and told me I was the most precious thing in his life. I'll always take care of you, Judy, he had said. And he hadn't lied. I was the one who had failed. I didn't protect what we had built together over 40 years. Raindrops splattered against the windowsill, forming tiny rivulets down the glass. Just like the tears on my cheeks, slow at first, then faster, until I was sobbing, my face buried in my hands. The howling wind outside drowned out my sobs. I wasn't just mourning today's humiliation, I was mourning 7 years of silent compliance. 7 years of letting my son use me, lie to me, drain the last of my strength. 7 years of betraying Thomas's memory with my weakness. Suddenly, something inside me snapped. I felt it physically, like a taut string breaking. The tears stopped as abruptly as they had started. A strange calm settled over me, cold as a knife's edge, and just as sharp. I straightened up and wiped my face with a kitchen towel. Number enough. My gaze fell on an old photo, held to the fridge with a magnet, Thomas, little Eddie, and me at the beach. Eddie had been 7 in that photo, looking at his father with adoration. When had it all gone wrong? At what point had that sweet boy turned into a selfish monster? I rose from the chair and walked to the hallway. In the coat closet, on the top shelf, was a large cardboard box with Thomas's old things. I pulled over a chair and stood on tiptoe, trying to reach it. My fingers caught the edge, but instead of pulling it toward me, I accidentally knocked it off. It toppled down with a crash, spilling its contents across the hallway. "Damn it," I muttered, kneeling down. Among the scattered items, Thomas's old sweater, his baseball card collection, a stamp album, my attention was drawn to a thick cream-colored envelope. It looked newer than the rest, as if it had been placed there more recently. On the front, in Thomas's careful handwriting, were the words, "Judith, open only in an emergency." My heart clenched. I would recognize that handwriting anywhere, small letters, slanted slightly to the right, with a distinct flourish on the T. Thomas had always taken pride in his penmanship, a legacy from his father, an English teacher. With trembling hands, I picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed, just neatly closed. I ran a finger along the edge, tearing the paper, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "My dearest Judy," the letter began. I sank into a chair, unable to stand. It was dated August 17th, 2016, exactly 1 month before Thomas's sudden death. "If you're reading this, it means my fears have come true, and you found yourself in a difficult situation after I'm gone. I hope I'm wrong, and this envelope remains unopened, but my heart tells me I need to be prepared for the worst. Judy, I never told you how deeply I worried about our son. I didn't want to upset you, knowing how much you love him, despite his faults. But you've always been too kind to him, too forgiving, and I was too weak to insist otherwise." Edward's behavior began changing in his teens. He stopped being that open-hearted boy who brought home stray kittens and gave his lunch to a homeless man in the park. He became selfish, manipulative. He was only ever gentle with you. I think he always knew you were his weak spot. Remember the college incident? When he convinced us to take out a loan for tuition, then dropped out after the first semester? Or when he borrowed money for his wedding to Melissa, then disappeared for 3 weeks? No explanation? No money? Those weren't youthful mistakes. That was a pattern. I'm afraid that after my death, he may take advantage of your kindness. He may try to use you, perhaps even take the house. Our house, Judy, your only protection, your fortress. Don't let him take it from you. For years, I've been secretly putting aside money in a separate account. I didn't tell you, partly not to worry you, and partly, I'll admit, so you wouldn't accidentally tell Edward. In the attached passbook, you'll find the details. This money is for you, Judy. Just for you. Not for Edward, not for his next business project, not for his debts. Use it to protect yourself, if you need to. There is one other person who knows about my concerns. Our family lawyer, Michael Rossi. He promised to watch over you and help if needed. His number is on the back of this page. Judy, my love, be strong. You're much stronger than you think. And remember, I loved you every minute of our 40 years together, and I will love you forever. Thomas. I turned the page with shaking hands. On the back was indeed a phone number and a brief note. Michael knows everything. Trust him. Attached to the letter was a bank passbook in Thomas McPherson's name. I opened it and gasped. The account held a sum with 5 zeros, money I had never known existed, enough for a comfortable life for several years, or even to buy a small apartment. I sat on the floor among Thomas's scattered belongings, clutching his final message to my chest, and felt something ignite within me. Not anger, resolve. Thomas had believed in me. He had known this day might come, and he had prepared for it. Now it was my turn to act. I stood, put everything back into the box, except for the letter and the passbook, which I tucked into my robe pocket. Then I went to the bedroom, took out an old, rarely used mobile phone from the drawer, and dialed the number on the back of the letter. After the 3rd ring, a man's voice answered, "Michael Rossi speaking." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Michael, this is Judith McPherson, Thomas's widow. We need to talk." There was a brief pause, and then he replied, as if he'd been waiting for this call for years. "Judith, at last, I'm so glad you called. Would you be willing to meet me at my office? I'll send a car for you." "Yes," I said. "That would be very helpful." "Perfect. The car will be at your house in 30 minutes. The driver's name is James. He's aware of the situation. You can trust him, Judith." I changed into the best clothes I owned, a dark blue dress I'd worn to a friend's funeral last year, and a worn but still elegant coat. I slipped the letter and the passbook into my handbag and stepped out onto the porch exactly 25 minutes later. A black sedan was already waiting. The driver, a silver-haired man in his 60s, jumped out with an umbrella and walked me to the passenger seat. "Mrs. McPherson," he said as he opened the door. "I'm James. Mr. Rossi is expecting you." The drive took about 40 minutes. We crossed the entire city to a business district where a modern office complex stood. James escorted me to the elevator and we rode up to the 12th floor. Michael Rossi's office looked exactly as I'd imagined, sleek, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows and leather chairs. Michael himself, a middle-aged man with graying temples and kind eyes, greeted me at the door. "Judith," he said, taking my hands in his. "I'm so glad to finally meet you in person. Thomas spoke about you often." I gave him a faint smile. "We met at the funeral," I said. "Yes, of course." He nodded. "But there was no opportunity to talk properly then. Please have a seat. James will bring us some tea." I sank into a soft leather chair, feeling out of place in this luxurious office. Michael sat across from me and looked at me intently. "You found the letter," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I nodded and pulled the envelope from my handbag. Today, completely by accident, it had been with Thomas's things all these years. Michael sighed. "Thomas was deeply concerned about you. He sensed that Edward might cause problems." "Were you keeping tabs on me?" I asked, suddenly realizing how strange the situation was. "Not exactly," Michael shook his head. "Let's say I kept a finger on the pulse. I stayed in contact with your neighbor, Mrs. Parker. She would occasionally update me on your well-being, and I knew that Edward moved back in with you 7 years ago. I felt a twinge of irritation. And you did nothing?" "I couldn't," Michael said gently. "I had no right. Thomas only asked me to intervene if there was a direct threat, or if you came to me yourself. You're an adult, Judith. You have the right to make your own decisions, even if they're not the wisest." I lowered my eyes. He was right, of course. No one could protect me from my own weakness. "But now you're here," Michael continued, "and I can tell you something you need to know." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. "About 3 months ago, Edward came to me for a consultation." "Edward?" I asked, surprised. "Why?" Michael hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. He inquired about the process of declaring an elderly relative legally incapacitated, specifically his mother. I felt a chill spread through me. Incapacitated? Me? He was very cautious in his wording, Michael said, spoke hypothetically, but he asked for very specific details, what evidence the court would require, the cost of psychiatric evaluations, whether a guardian could take control of the ward's property. "Property?" I echoed. "The house." "Most likely," Michael nodded. I pretended not to understand his real intentions, gave him a generic consultation and advised him to seek out a different specialist. But after he left, I contacted my nephew. He's a private investigator. We decided to observe your son's activities a little. Michael opened the folder and laid several photographs in front of me. In them, Edward was with a man in a business suit. They stood in front of our house. In another photo, they sat in a cafe looking through documents. "This is Robert Klein, a realtor from Premium Homes," Michael explained. "He specializes in real estate in your neighborhood. Over the last 2 months, Edward met with him 6 times. Twice he took him to view your house. Once when you were at a doctor's appointment, and once when you visited your friend in the hospital." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. "He wants to sell our house?" "I'm afraid so, and it seems he's been preparing for it seriously." My nephew managed to snap photos of some of the documents Edward showed the realtor. Michael pulled out another photo. It was a zoomed-in shot of a document with my signature at the bottom. This is a power of attorney authorizing him to sell the property on your behalf. Did you ever sign such a document? I shook my head, nausea rising in my chest. Never. I'd remember something like that. I thought so, Michael said. It's a forgery. A crude one, frankly. Any expert could spot it in seconds. But for preliminary talks with a realtor, it was enough. He forged my signature? I couldn't believe it. Why? Why not just ask? Michael looked at me with sympathy. Because you would have said no, Judith, and real estate prices in your area have risen by nearly 30% recently. Your house is now worth almost twice what it was when Thomas died. And Edward wants that money, I whispered. Not just that, Michael added grimly. We found something else. He pulled out more documents, copies of loan agreements. Edward has taken out 3 large loans from different banks. In each case, your house was listed as collateral, again, with a forged signature. I stared at the papers, but the lines blurred in front of my eyes. I could barely breathe. This is fraud, I managed to say. Forgery. A criminal offense, Michael confirmed, with a possible sentence of 2 to 5 years, depending on the circumstances, but we don't have to go to court if we're careful. He leaned toward me across the desk. Judith, you have a choice. We can stop your son right now, go to the police with a fraud complaint and show them the evidence. He'll go to prison, and you'll be able to live in peace. Prison, I repeated, my heart clenching. Despite everything I'd just learned, he was still my son, my little Eddie, who used to run to me with scraped knees, asking for a kiss to make it better. Or, Michael continued, we can take another route. Develop a plan that protects you and your property, but gives Edward a chance to wake up, a chance to make amends. Thomas believed there was still something good in Edward, something worth saving, he said. That's why he didn't cut him out of the will entirely, even though I advised him to. He believed that in a crisis, Edward might choose the right path. I remembered the look on Thomas's face whenever he watched our son. Even in the hardest times, when Edward disappointed us again and again, there was always hope in his eyes. What kind of plan? I asked quietly. Michael smiled, for the first time since our meeting began. First, we need more information. We need to know how far Edward's preparations have gone, who else he's spoken to, what promises he's made. That will require my nephew's help. Then, he paused, we'll stage something for your son, a surprise that will make him face the consequences of his actions. I sat in silence, turning over his words. The rain outside was fading. The day was coming to a close, and with it, my old life was ending, a life in which I had been weak, frightened, used. I agree, I said at last. What do I need to do? I'll call you. As I left the office, I felt a fire ignite inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, a fire of resolve, of strength, and yes, even of anger, a fire that would light my path in the battle ahead. Today, a new chapter of my life began, one where I was no longer a victim, but a warrior, and woe to anyone who stands in my way. The phone in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen with a number I hadn't dialed in nearly 3 years. 3 long years of silence, misunderstanding, and pain. It all began with that awful Christmas when Edward accused Rebecca of turning everyone against him. My daughter had merely expressed concern that her brother was living off me. That was the only time she ever dared speak up. Edward threw such a tantrum that the holiday was completely ruined. And then he gave me an ultimatum. Him or Rebecca. And I, the old fool, chose him. Or rather, I stayed silent, which, to Rebecca, was the same as betrayal. My fingers hesitated over the call button. What would I say to her? How could I explain the years of silence? How could I admit that I had let Edward tear our family apart? Come on, Judith, I whispered to myself. You have to do this. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the call button. The dial tone? Maybe she wouldn't answer? Maybe she'd changed her number, or, seeing my name on the screen, would decide she didn't want to talk to me. "Hello?" Her voice was just as I remembered, melodic, with a faint huskiness. The voice of my little girl, now a successful doctor, wife, and mother. "Rebecca," I said, barely managing to steady my voice. "It's Mom." Silence. So long that I thought she had hung up. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. No, hello, no, how are you? Just a direct question, behind which I could hear the pain of 3 years of separation. Yes, I didn't try to soften it. I need your help. It's Edward. I knew it, Rebecca interrupted bitterly. What is it this time? Another business project? More debt? Did he get into trouble again? I gripped the phone tighter. He's trying to take my house, Rebecca. He wants to have me declared legally incompetent. Silence again, but now it was different, shocked, stunned. "I'll be there in 2 hours, she said at last. "Don't go anywhere." The call ended. I set the phone on my lap and exhaled slowly. The first step was taken. Rebecca arrived even earlier than she'd promised. When I opened the door, the first thing that struck me was how much she looked like her father. The same green eyes, the same shape of her lips, the same determined expression. She stood on the porch, elegant and composed in her tailored coat, with a shoulder bag and a look of professional concern on her face. "Mom," she said formally. But then something in her face softened and she suddenly stepped forward and hugged me tightly. "I've missed you so much." I couldn't breathe. I wrapped my arms around my daughter, tears rolling down my cheeks. "Me too, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." We stood in the hallway for a long time, holding each other as if trying to make up for all the lost years. Finally, Rebecca stepped back and looked me straight in the eyes. "Tell me everything," she demanded, and I did. About Thomas's letter, about my meeting with Michael, about the forged documents, and Edward's plans to sell the house. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her lips pressed tighter and her face growing paler with every new revelation. "That bastard," she breathed when I finished. "That piece of scum. You know, Mom, I always saw who he really was, but even I didn't think he was capable of this." She stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. "We need allies, people who can testify to his true nature if this goes to court." "Like who?" I asked. "Like," Rebecca stopped, "his ex-wife. Melissa. I've kept in touch with her all these years. She has a lot to say." I flinched. Melissa, the quiet blonde woman Edward had brought home 10 years ago. Their marriage lasted only 2 years, but in that time she gave birth to a son Edward had barely seen since the divorce. "Will she help?" Rebecca nodded. "Melissa's been waiting for the chance to see Edward get what he deserves. You know all those years he told you he was paying child support? Showed you those receipts?" I nodded slowly, my stomach turning cold. "It was a lie, Mom. He hasn't paid a cent. Melissa had to work 3 jobs to feed their son. If it hadn't been for help from me and my husband, they wouldn't have made it." I buried my face in my hands. How could I have been so blind, so naive? "We'll also need Uncle Henry," Rebecca continued. "He always saw right through Edward. And the neighbors, Mrs. Parker, the Johnsons, they've been watching him take advantage of you for years." "I'll call Michael," I said, standing up. "He needs to know we've started moving." It was nearly 7 p.m. We gathered in my small living room, the same place where just yesterday Edward had laughed loudly with his friends, emptying my fridge. Today, the room had transformed into a makeshift command center. Neighborhood maps, documents, and notes were spread across the old oak table Thomas and I had chosen together. In a way, it felt like a military operation, a war for my home, my dignity, and my future. "All right," Michael tapped his pen on the table, calling for attention. "We know Edward is planning to use tomorrow's barbecue as a pretext to show the house to potential buyers. Judith is supposed to disappear for the whole day." "The realtor has already confirmed his attendance," added Michael's nephew, scrolling through his phone. "Along with the Henderson couple." They think they're going to a friendly get-together where they'll just happen to see their dream home. I clenched my hands, trying to steady the tremble. Sitting here, in my own home, planning an operation against my own son, it felt surreal, like I was trapped in a strange dream. "What are we going to do?" I asked, glancing at the kitchen, where Thomas and I had spent years making family dinners, where little Eddie had once learned to bake cookies. Just storm in with the police and arrest him? Melissa, sitting beside me on the old sofa, shook her head. "We need more than an arrest, Judith. Edward needs a lesson he'll never forget." "Exactly," Michael agreed, pacing by the bookshelf where family photos still stood. "If we just call the police, he might get a slap on the wrist, pay a fine, or do community service. He won't learn anything." "There's something else," Rebecca said quietly, adjusting the curtain to better see the street. "Our son. He needs to be protected from a father who sees him only as a tool for manipulation. If we just hand this over to the courts, Edward could use his parental rights to pressure Melissa." I stared at the wall where Thomas's portrait hung. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall, reminding me of the day Edward ordered me to go out somewhere. "You're right," I said finally. "A simple exposure won't be enough. We need something that will make him truly feel ashamed. Something that shows him the full consequences of his actions." My brother Henry, who had been surveying the backyard for good observation points, returned and closed the door behind him. "I've got an idea," he said, looking at Michael. "Remember the Johnson case? That con man who scammed half a dozen elderly people?" Michael frowned, then his face lit up in recognition. "The auction," he clapped his hands. "Brilliant, Henry." "Auction," I repeated, not understanding. "A special auction, Judith," Michael explained, his tone brightening. "We'll hold a charity auction right here during the barbecue. Each item will be something Edward bought using your money. And next to the price, its true cost, what it cost you." I looked around the room at the things filling it. How many had been bought with my last savings? How many had Edward simply taken because I couldn't say no? "For example," Michael continued, pointing to the gaming console beneath the television, "his game console. Price, $400. Real cost, 6 months' worth of arthritis medication, which you stopped buying so he could have his toy." "Or his laptop," added Rebecca, nodding toward the desk in the corner where Edward's expensive computer lay. "Bought with the money from selling Mom's wedding ring." I flinched, instinctively touching the ring finger that had remained bare since I sold the ring. Thomas had slipped it onto my finger 45 years ago, promising to love me forever. But Edward swore he needed the laptop to look for work. "This is cruel," I whispered, looking around the room, which now felt like a museum of my sacrifices and his betrayals. "Cruel?" Henry echoed, pointing to the worn carpet stained with beer Edward had spilled. "And what he did to you for 7 years, wasn't that cruel? Starving you, throwing out your medicine because it was too expensive, humiliating you in front of the neighbors?" "This isn't cruelty, Judith," Melissa said gently, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "It's justice. Edward needs to understand the cost of his betrayal, and having the realtor and potential buyers there will make the lesson even clearer." I nodded slowly, looking at the portrait of Thomas. What would he say now? Would he approve of our plan? But then I remembered his letter, his foresight, his care for my future. Yes, Thomas would understand. "Who'll be the auctioneer?" I asked. "I will." Henry volunteered instantly, stepping into the center of the room with an imaginary gavel in hand. "With great pleasure." His voice echoed through the room, and for the first time I noticed how much he resembled our father, just as commanding, with a booming voice and an innate sense of justice. "It's settled," said Michael, "but the auction alone isn't enough. We need legally admissible evidence we can use in court if Edward refuses to cooperate." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the dining table, the same table where our family had once gathered for holidays, now the setting for a trap planned for one of our own. "I've prepared a special document, a mock sales agreement for your house. The signature and date fields are blank." "Why?" I asked, confused. "We'll accidentally leave it on the coffee table in the living room," Michael explained, gesturing toward the low glass table in front of the sofa. "Edward will likely show it to the realtor, and their conversation will be recorded with hidden cameras. If we're lucky, he might even say something like, 'It's all ready, I just need to forge Mom's signature,' or something along those lines." "And what if he suspects a setup?" I asked, glancing around the room, trying to see it through my son's eyes. "Would he notice something off? Would he sense a trap?" "The document will look real," Michael assured me. "Official letterhead, stamps, watermarks, but with a small, subtle legal error in the wording that makes it invalid. So even if he tries to use it, it won't hold up in court." Jamie, Rebecca's son, was already inspecting various corners of the room, estimating the best spots to place hidden cameras. "This spot will work," he said, pointing to the bookshelf, "and another in the kitchen, near the fridge." "What about audio?" asked David, Rebecca's husband, checking the windows and doors to find the best surveillance points. "Jamie's cameras are great, but they won't catch everything. What if the key conversation happens in the bedroom or the backyard?" "I've got that covered," said Rebecca, pulling a small device from her bag. "David and I will park our van around the corner. We have professional-grade equipment for recording and listening in." "From where?" I asked, eyeing the complex tech they were already setting up in my living room. David flushed slightly. "Let's just say my therapy practice sometimes requires specialized tools for working with PTSD patients. It's all legal." "And I'll place extra recorders around the house," Melissa added, pulling a few tiny devices from her pocket. "Small and well hidden, one in the vase with the fake flowers." She pointed to the centerpiece on the dining table. "Another in the bookshelf." Michael pulled out another folder from his briefcase. "And I'll prepare the paperwork for the surprise at the end of the auction. Formal charges of fraud and forgery, bank statements proving the illegal loans, witness statements from neighbors." The plan was coming together, transforming from a vague idea into a concrete strategy. I felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, determination, and something that felt like anticipation. My home, which had been a place of humiliation and suffering for so long, was about to become the stage for restoring justice. "What do I need to do?" I asked, ready to play any role in this performance. "The hardest part," Michael said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Spend the night at home as usual. Act like you know nothing." The next day was surprisingly sunny, as if nature itself supported our plan. I woke up early and stood under the shower for a long time, trying to wash away the tension and fear. Through the wall, I could hear Edward snoring. He'd come home late, drunk as usual, and was now sleeping soundly, unaware of what was coming. I slowly packed a small bag, just enough for Edward to see that I was going out when he finally woke up. I made breakfast with extra care. Perhaps for the last time, I was doing something for my son willingly, not out of fear. By 11, Edward finally appeared in the kitchen, rumpled and red-eyed. "You remember my friends are coming today, right?" he said, flopping into the chair, where I'd already placed a plate of eggs and toast. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, making my voice sound as obedient as ever, though I was boiling inside. "I'll be gone all day, meeting my friends at the mall." Edward nodded without looking up from his phone. "Great, and try not to come back before 8, okay? We might run a little late." "Whatever you say, dear," I said, pretending to fuss with the dishes so he wouldn't see my face. "Do you need anything else before I go?" "Yeah." He finally looked up at me. "Where are the keys to the wardrobe in your bedroom? I want to show my friend's dad's collection." Dad's collection? Thomas had no collection, just a few keepsakes stored in a small box in our bedroom. Clearly, Edward wanted access to my room to show it to potential buyers. "Of course," I said, pulling out my key ring and separating one key, the one that unlocked not only the wardrobe, but also the small safe cleverly disguised as its bottom, where I now kept Thomas's letter and the bank book. But Edward didn't know about the safe. "Just please be careful with your father's things," I said. "They mean a lot to me." "Don't worry, Mom," he said, smiling at me for the first time in days. I respect the legacy. Legacy. How fitting a word for someone planning to steal not just a house, but the memory of his father. After breakfast, I made a show of leaving the house with my bag over my shoulder, calling a loud goodbye to Edward. But instead of heading toward the bus stop, I turned the corner, where Henry was already waiting in the car. "Everything ready?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Yes," I replied, casting one last look at my home. "Edward's completely convinced I'm gone for the day." We drove a few blocks and stopped near an unremarkable gray van parked in the shade of a large oak, the same oak Edward once fell from as a boy, breaking his arm. Inside the van were Rebecca, David, and Jamie, surrounded by screens and various pieces of equipment. "Welcome to Command Central, Grandma," Jamie grinned. I'd never heard him call me Grandma before, and that word warmed my heart. I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't alone. I had family, real family. "Cameras are live," he reported, nodding to the central monitor, which showed multiple angles of my house: the living room, the kitchen, the backyard. Audio systems are up, too. "How long do we wait?" Henry asked, settling onto a folding chair beside me. Rebecca checked her phone. "Klein and the Hendersons are due at 2. Michael and Melissa will be ready by 3. Hopefully, we'll have enough recordings by then." I nodded, watching the screens. One showed Edward bustling around the kitchen, my kitchen, surrounded by my things. He was arranging bottles of alcohol and laying out snacks. Then he pulled expensive steaks from the fridge, clearly not purchased with his non-existent income. His phone rang. "Yes, Robert," we heard Edward say through the speakers. "Everything's going according to plan. The old lady's gone for the day." "Yeah, the house is completely ours." "The Hendersons on their way? Perfect." He paused, listening. No official documents yet, but that's not a problem. I've already made a deal with a doctor. 15% of the sale price for a certificate declaring her incompetent. Once that's done, I'll become her guardian and sell the house with no red tape. I felt the blood drain from my face. He had even found a doctor willing to declare me insane for a bribe. "Oh my God," Rebecca whispered, gripping my hand. "That's not just fraud anymore. That's a full-blown criminal conspiracy." "Shh," David raised a hand. "Keep listening." "Yeah, it needs some work," Edward continued, pacing my kitchen, where I had cooked thousands of meals, many for him. "But the price is below market value. The Hendersons are getting a great deal." "Me? I've already picked out an apartment downtown and a car. As soon as I get the money, I'll put down the deposit." He laughed, an ugly, barking laugh that sounded nothing like my little Eddie. The old bat? Who cares? A nursing home or something. Doesn't need to be fancy. I'll have to support her for a while, just for appearances. Then I'll file to revoke guardianship. Yeah, happens all the time. I'll say I can't cope anymore. Too stressful emotionally. The state will take her off my hands. I listened as my son plotted my fate as if I were some disposable object. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of liberation. The last of my doubts vanished. I no longer felt guilty for setting a trap for my own son. He deserved every second of what was coming. "We've got everything we need," David said quietly, glancing at me with compassion. "That recording alone is enough to open a criminal case." "No," I shook my head, wiping my tears. "We stick to the plan. He needs to face the consequences face to face, in my house, among my things, in front of the people he tried to deceive." At that moment, the screen showed a black SUV pulling up in front of the house. 3 people got out, a middle-aged man in a business suit, obviously realtor Robert Klein, and an older couple, the Hendersons, potential buyers of my home. Edward rushed to the porch, greeting them with a wide smile. "Robert, right on time. And you must be Mr. and Mrs. Henderson? Please, come in. Welcome to my family home." My family home. Not our home or my parents' home, but my family home, as if he were already the sole owner. I watched as they entered, as Edward led an impromptu tour of the living room where I'd spent most of my life. The living room needs a little renovation, of course, but just look at the potential. Original fireplace, oak floors under this carpet. Very charming, Mrs. Henderson commented, looking around. And where's your mother? Robert said we might get a chance to speak with her. Edward tensed slightly but quickly recovered. Mom? Oh, she's out with her friends today. You know, at her age, socializing is important. I encouraged her to spend more time with her peers. Very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Henderson smiled. As I mentioned to Robert, Edward said, lowering his voice and moving closer to the hidden camera, as if performing just for us. The situation is delicate. Mom's getting older, and this house is a lot for her to manage. We're planning a move to a more suitable place for her, with care, supervision. I understand, Mr. Henderson nodded. Went through that with my mother last year. Not an easy decision. Very tough, Edward agreed, sighing dramatically, but her well-being is my top priority. I felt nausea rise in my throat at his sheer hypocrisy. Let's continue the tour, he said. Upstairs are 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. Then we can head out to the yard, where I'll grill you some fantastic steaks. They went up the stairs, and I saw Edward unlock the door to my bedroom with the key I had given him that morning. This is the master bedroom. Mom stays here for now, but of course, once the sale is finalized, it'll be vacated. Mrs. Henderson looked around with clear interest. Very spacious, and such a lovely view from the window. What are these papers? She asked, pointing to the folder Michael had accidentally left on the coffee table. Edward stepped closer and picked up the folder. Oh, those are preliminary documents for the sale. I started preparing them early to speed up the process. May I take a look? Mr. Henderson asked. I'm a lawyer by training, though I haven't practiced in years. Edward hesitated for just a moment. Of course, he said, handing over the folder. All standard stuff, just needs a signature. Your mother's signature? Mr. Henderson asked, flipping through the document. I don't see her consent here. It's a formality, Edward waved him off. We've already discussed everything. She's on board. She just doesn't like paperwork. I see, Mr. Henderson said slowly, but there was doubt in his voice. At that moment, another car appeared on the screen. It was Michael's. He was driving, with Melissa beside him and a few more of our allies in the back seat. It's time, said Henry, standing up. Showtime. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins. There was no turning back now. Today, Edward would learn the price of betrayal. I'm ready, I said, my voice unexpectedly firm. I quietly unlocked the front door with my key. From the upper hallway, I could hear Edward's voice. And this room would make a perfect nursery if you have children. Morning sunlight, a great view. Rebecca and I tiptoed up the stairs. Henry stayed downstairs, coordinating the rest of our team over the phone. I knew every creaky floorboard in this house, how to avoid them when you didn't want to be heard. How many times had I come home late, trying not to wake Thomas after a night shift? How many times had I tiptoed into little Eddie's room just to watch him sleep? And finally, the master bedroom, I heard Edward say just outside my bedroom door. The most spacious room in the house. With a renovation, this could be turned into a master suite with a walk-in closet and private bathroom. I stopped at the threshold of the bedroom. Edward stood with his back to me, facing the Hendersons and Realtor Klein. They were the first to notice me, and their faces registered surprise. "And where does your mother sleep now?" asked Mrs. Henderson, peering at me oddly over Edward's shoulder. "Oh, she has a small room at the end of the hallway," Edward replied breezily. "Perfectly suitable for an older woman, less space to maintain, easier to clean." "And what about this room?" I asked softly, stepping forward. Edward spun around. His face, just moments ago lively and confident, froze in an expression of shock and horror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I walked slowly into the room, savoring the moment. I was wearing a dark blue dress, the very one Thomas had given me on our last anniversary. My hair was styled elegantly, like in my younger days. Silver earrings, my only remaining piece of jewelry, the one I hadn't sold to fund my son's whims, sparkled in my ears. "Surprise, darling," I said with a wide smile. I decided not to miss such an important event, like the sale of my own home. The silence in the room felt almost tangible. Mrs. Henderson began glancing around nervously, clearly sensing something was off. Realtor Klein took a small step back, as if trying to distance himself from the situation. "Mom," Edward finally managed to say. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat appearing on his forehead. "I thought you were at your friend's." "Changed my mind," I shrugged with mock nonchalance. "You know, at my age, one has the right to change plans. By the way, I don't believe we've been introduced." I turned to the Hendersons and extended my hand. "Judith McPherson, owner of this house, and you must be the interested buyers." Mr. Henderson awkwardly shook my hand, avoiding eye contact. "William Henderson, and this is my wife Margaret. We were told this was just a friendly viewing." "Oh, I'm sure," I nodded, still smiling. "My son is very friendly, especially when it comes to selling someone else's property." "Mom, you've got it all wrong," Edward cut in quickly, his voice high and strained. "I was just showing some friends around. We were discussing potential upgrades." "Is that so?" I raised an eyebrow. Because I thought I heard talk of the perfect price for a house in this condition, and how to deal with the elderly mother issue. Apologies if I misheard. My hearing isn't what it used to be. Klein's face turned ashen. "Mrs. McPherson, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I was under the impression you were fully informed." "Informed about what?" I asked, feigning confusion. "That my son is planning to sell the house I live in? Or that he intends to declare me legally incompetent to seize my assets?" Edward made a strange noise, half laugh, half sob. "Mom, you're obviously overtired. Maybe sit down, have a glass of water?" "I feel just fine, thank you," I replied, standing tall. "In fact, I feel better than I have in the past 7 years. You know," I turned to the Hendersons, "7 years ago, my son came back home for a couple of months while he looked for a job. Since then, he's been living off my pension, hasn't paid rent, hasn't helped around the house, and routinely brings over friends who empty my fridge." Mrs. Henderson flushed and began fiddling with her purse strap. We didn't know." "Of course you didn't," I said gently. "Lying is my son's special talent. I'm sure he told you he was a successful young man caring for his sweet old mother." The uncomfortable silence was answer enough. Edward seemed to finally collect himself. His voice grew firmer, a dangerous gleam appearing in his eyes. "Enough, Mom. You're making a fool of yourself. I think we should continue this conversation in private. Our guests can wait downstairs." He stepped toward me, clearly intending to escort me out, but I didn't budge. "Wonderful idea," I agreed. "Let's go downstairs. Since we're already discussing property sales, I thought we could start small." I paused dramatically. "Welcome to the charity auction." With that, I turned and headed toward the staircase. Rebecca, who had been waiting silently in the hallway, discreetly gave me a thumbs up. Edward, clearly confused, followed behind me, as did the bewildered Hendersons and the realtor. When we reached the living room, Edward came to a sudden stop. The room had been transformed. The furniture had been rearranged into what resembled an auction hall. Our chairs and armchairs were lined up in rows, like in a theater. At the front stood a small podium, made from a coffee table draped with an elegant cloth. On it rested a wooden gavel, the same one Thomas had used to hammer nails while building a birdhouse for the garden. And most importantly, the room was full of people. Our allies were already seated. Henry stood on the makeshift stage, looking impressive in his best suit. Melissa sat in the front row, holding the hand of a handsome boy of about 10, strikingly similar to Edward at that age. Next to her were Rebecca and her husband, David, Michael's nephew, several neighbors, and even the postman, who had witnessed me skipping medication purchases to pay bills for years. "What's going on?" Edward looked around, completely bewildered. "Who are all these people? What are they doing in my house?" "In your house?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I think we need to clear that up, and that's exactly why we're all here." I gestured to Klein and the Hendersons. "Please, have a seat. You're our guests of honor." They hesitantly sat in the back row, clearly uncomfortable. Klein looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. He glanced quickly toward the door, but Michael, as if reading his mind, stepped in front of it. "I think you'd better stay," he said with a professional smile. Edward lunged toward the door, but Henry gently yet firmly caught him by the elbow. "Sit down, nephew. The show's just getting started." "You have no right?" Edward struggled. "This is my house. You've broken into my house." "Actually, the house belongs to me," I said calmly. "If you don't believe me, we can show you the property deed." "Michael?" Michael pulled an official document from his briefcase and held it up for everyone to see. "The house is solely owned by Judith Elizabeth McPherson. No liens, no shared ownership." Edward opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. His gaze darted from face to face, as if searching for support or some explanation. Henry took the opportunity to gently but firmly seat him in a chair in the front row, directly facing the podium, next to Melissa and her son. When Edward saw his former son, his eyes widened in shock. The boy gave him a polite nod, but without a smile. "Hello, Dad. Long time no see?" "Jason," Edward muttered, "you've grown so much." "Children tend to grow," Melissa remarked dryly, "especially when they have enough to eat, thanks to a mother working 3 jobs, because some fathers think child support is optional." Edward flushed crimson and turned away, only to be met with Rebecca's disapproving stare. "Little sister," he said with a strained smile, "it's been ages." "Not long enough to forget how you gave Mom an ultimatum. It's either me or her," Rebecca replied coldly. Edward shrank into his chair, suddenly aware he was surrounded by people who truly knew who he was. I stepped onto the podium and addressed the room. "Dear friends, thank you for coming to our unusual auction. A special thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, who discovered they are not potential buyers, but honored guests at our event." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. The Hendersons looked like they would have preferred to be anywhere else. "Today we're hosting a very special kind of auction," I continued. "An auction of items that carry immense value, not in dollars, but in the human sacrifices made for them. And to do this properly, I need the help of a professional. Henry?" My brother stepped onto the podium and picked up the wooden gavel. "Welcome to a very special charity auction," his booming voice filled the room. "Today, we're here to help an elderly woman who supported a healthy adult man for 7 years, who now tries to sell her house behind her back." With each word, Edward sank deeper into his chair. His face had taken on a grayish hue. "Let's begin with the first lot," Henry announced. Jamie, Rebecca's son, rolled in a small table on wheels from the adjoining room. Sitting atop it was the latest model of a gaming console, purchased by Edward just 3 months ago. "Lot number 1, Henry said solemnly, lifting the console like a sacred artifact. The newest gaming console, bought with money set aside for a hip replacement surgery. Starting bid, the equivalent cost of 6 months' worth of arthritis medication. At the same moment, Jamie switched on the big TV screen. A video began playing. Edward speaking with a store clerk. "Yes, I know it's expensive, but I've got money saved up. The old lady was putting it away for some surgery, but honestly, at her age, what's the point? She'll kick the bucket soon anyway." Mrs. Henderson gasped and covered her mouth. Mr. Henderson straightened up, his face hardening. "That's fake," Edward shouted, jumping to his feet. "That's a fake recording." "I don't think so," Michael replied calmly. "It's from the store's security camera, legally admissible evidence, and it aligns perfectly with medical records regarding Mrs. McPherson's condition. Would you like to challenge it in court?" "And besides," Henry added, "we have plenty more. For example, A recording of your call to the doctor you tried to bribe into declaring your mother legally incompetent, or forged documents bearing your fake signature. Edward collapsed back into his chair, his knees suddenly turning to jelly. Realtor Klein, taking advantage of the momentary chaos, tried to quietly slip toward the door, but Michael gently stopped him. "Not so fast, Mr. Klein. You should stay. After all, you discussed the sale of a house without the owner's consent. That could seriously impact your real estate license. Wouldn't you agree?" Klein turned pale and silently returned to his seat. Henry continued the auction, rapping the gavel on the podium. "So, the first lot, the gaming console. Starting price, 6 months of Judith McPherson's pain and suffering. Any takers?" The silence in the room was deafening. Edward sat hunched in his seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Henry gave a satisfied nod. "All right, let's move on to the second lot." I watched it all unfold with surprising calm. I should have been in pain, but instead, I felt an odd sense of relief, as if the burden that had weighed on my shoulders for years was finally beginning to lift. The looks of genuine shock on the Hendersons and Klein's faces told me they had seen the truth. And Edward, for the first time in years, he didn't look smug or arrogant. He looked broken, pathetic. All his carefully constructed self-image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The auction continued, and with each new lot, I felt myself returning to who I truly was. Not just Edward's mother, not just Thomas's wife, but Judith McPherson, a woman with her own life, her own dreams, and her own dignity. After the first lot was presented, the room fell into a heavy silence. Edward sat sunken into the chair as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Mrs. Henderson kept looking around anxiously, while her husband whispered something quietly in her ear. Realtor Klein looked like he might be sick. Henry scanned the room with satisfaction and continued. "After such a moving start, I think we're ready for the next item." He signaled to Jamie, who rolled another table up to the podium. This time, a sleek, expensive-looking laptop rested on it, brand new, with a famous logo gleaming on its lid. Henry paused, lifted the laptop, and examined it carefully, as if appraising a fine treasure. "And now, our most valuable item," he announced solemnly. A premium laptop, purchased with the money from selling the engagement ring Judith's husband gave her 45 years ago. I instinctively touched the ring finger on my left hand, where that tiny but precious diamond had sat for decades. Thomas had saved for 2 years to buy it, denying himself every luxury. "This stone will never lose its shine, just like my love for you," he'd told me. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. A lump rose in my throat, and for the first time all evening, I nearly cried. Suddenly, Melissa rose from her seat. Her face was pale, eyes glassy. She walked over and hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry, Judith," she whispered. "I had no idea. If only I'd known." "It's all right, dear," I stroked her back. "It's not your fault." Melissa turned to Edward, her eyes now blazing with anger. "She sold her engagement ring. Do you understand what that means? The one thing that still tied her to the love of her life? And you told me you couldn't pay child support because you were supporting your poor mother." Edward said nothing. He sat with his head bowed, shoulders slumped. Whether it was real remorse or just another performance, I couldn't tell. Henry struck the gavel, bringing the room's attention back. "On the day Edward came to his mother, asking for a laptop to look for work," Henry continued, "Judith stood for hours in front of the jewelry box, holding that ring. She cried. I know, because she called me afterward to ask if she did the right thing." He paused. And the very next day, Edward was playing online games for hours on his new laptop. Jamie turned on the screen, and a video played. Edward in an electronics store, laughing with the clerk, waving a wad of cash. Yeah, the money's from selling some old trinket. Useless to her anyway, her husband's long dead. I need a proper machine for streaming. I'm gonna be a professional gamer, can you believe it? Gonna earn thousands a month. The recording cut off. Rebecca sat with her face in her hands. Her husband had his arm around her shoulders. That old trinket, Henry said quietly, was the last gift of a dying husband to his beloved wife, a symbol of a love that lasted nearly half a century. While everyone processed this, Michael quietly approached Edward. He leaned down and placed a slim black folder in front of him. "This is a copy of a police report regarding real estate fraud and document forgery," he said softly. But in the silence of the room, his words were heard by all. "The original will be submitted tomorrow unless we reach an agreement today." With trembling hands, Edward opened the folder. His already pale face turned a sickly shade of green. "You can't," he muttered. "I'm your son." "Exactly why I'm giving you a chance," I said, addressing him directly for the first time. "A chance you don't deserve." Henry cleared his throat, bringing the room's attention back. "And now," he announced, "we come to our final lot." Jamie brought out an old, worn leather-bound album onto the podium. I recognized it instantly. It was the family album Thomas and I had started from the first day of our life together. Henry carefully opened the album and showed the first page. This album tells the story of the McPherson family. Here are wedding photos of Thomas and Judith, their first home, the birth of their children. He began to slowly turn the pages, pausing at each photograph. Here's Edward as a newborn, in the arms of his beaming mother. Here's his first birthday. Look at the cake Judith baked, even though she'd just had a complicated surgery. Here's Edward's first day of school. Thomas took the day off work for it, even though it cost him his bonus. Here's Edward's graduation. Judith worked overtime for 3 months to pay for his suit and prom night. With each page turned, each story told, I saw something shifting in Edward's expression. Beneath the mask of fear and anger, something else began to emerge. Perhaps awareness. Henry reached the photographs of Edward's son, Jason, with Melissa. "And here," he said, pointing to a picture of the smiling toddler, "is Jason, whom his father hasn't seen in years. This photo is the last one in the album. After that, empty pages. Pages that could have been filled with happy memories, if not for the selfishness of one man." Henry closed the album and laid it on the podium. "The starting price for this lot, the dignity of a son, which, sadly, has turned out to be priceless, or perhaps it's worth exactly the value of this house." At that moment, Melissa stood again. She looked resolute, though her voice trembled slightly. "I want everyone to know the truth," she began. "For 7 years, Edward didn't pay a cent in child support for his son. 7 years of telling the court he had no income and lived off his sick mother. And all that time, he told me he was sending her money to buy medicine and pay for surgery." She turned to Edward, her eyes blazing. "I worked 3 jobs. Jason couldn't join any sports teams. We didn't have the money. He didn't even have a winter coat last year. I had to buy one at a thrift shop. And you? You were buying gaming consoles and planning how to sell your mother's house." Jason, sitting beside her, looked at his father with an expression that broke my heart, a mix of disappointment, hurt, and resignation no 10-year-old should have. Suddenly, Jamie switched the big screen back on. Footage appeared, taken just hours earlier, Edward showing the Hendersons and the realtor around the house, talking about renovation plans, how he'd get rid of the old woman, and what kind of car he'd buy with the money. Mr. Henderson stood up. "I think it's time we go," he said, reaching for his wife's hand. "We don't want to be part of this." Mrs. Henderson, a look of deep disgust on her face, followed him. "So I take it the house isn't for sale," she muttered as she passed Edward. "What a relief, for your mother." Realtor Klein tried to quietly slip out behind them, but Michael stopped him again. "Mr. Klein, before you leave, I'd like to discuss certain ethical aspects of your business, specifically your involvement in a deal to sell property without the owner's consent. I'm sure the Real Estate Ethics Committee will be very interested in this case." Klein swallowed hard. His tie suddenly seemed far too tight. I was misled. Edward assured me his mother agreed to the sale. I would never have." Save your explanations for the official investigation, Michael cut him off. Or, we can reach an alternative agreement. They stepped aside, whispering quietly. Edward was left alone, surrounded by people who knew the truth about him. He looked like a cornered animal, frightened, angry, and dangerous. Suddenly, he leapt to his feet, knocking over the chair. "You planned all of this," he screamed. "Put on a whole show just to humiliate me, so everyone would see me as some kind of monster." "No, son," I said softly. "We simply showed the truth. Your truth." "What truth?" he practically roared. "That I wanted a better life? That I was sick of living in this dump? That I deserve more than wasting away here with—" He caught himself, but it was too late. Everyone already knew what he had meant to say. "With me?" I finished for him. "With your mother, who gave up everything so you could live comfortably, who sold her wedding ring so you could have your toy." Edward suddenly seemed to deflate. He collapsed to his knees, covering his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. "Mom, what have you done?" he sobbed. "You ruined my life. Everyone will know now. Everyone will find out." I looked at him, my son, my little boy, who had grown up and become someone so unfamiliar. I wanted to feel pity, compassion, motherly love, but all I felt was exhaustion and a strange calm. "No, son," I said, stepping closer. "You ruined your life when you chose to betray your own mother. I only held up a mirror." He looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. Were those tears real, or was this just another performance? "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to send me to prison?" I didn't have time to answer. The door to the living room suddenly opened, and all heads turned at the sound. A distinguished elderly gentleman stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture that of a man used to command and respect. "James," I exclaimed, recognizing Thomas's old friend. We hadn't seen each other in years, but he looked almost unchanged. Those same sharp eyes, that steady gaze, and the faint smile at the corners of his lips. "Hello, Judith," he said, walking in and kissing my hand. "Forgive the intrusion. Michael invited me." He glanced around the room, his eyes resting on Edward, still kneeling. "I see I arrived just in time," he remarked dryly. "James, what are you doing here?" I asked, still not believing my eyes. He sighed and looked me straight in the eye. "Judith, I saw and heard everything. Thomas was right about the boy." He nodded toward Edward. "It's time to fulfill the promise I made to your husband before he died." "Promise?" I echoed. "Yes," James nodded. "Thomas knew this day would come sooner or later, the day Edward would cross the final line. And he made me swear that I would help. Both of you." James walked over to Edward, who was still kneeling, and extended a hand to him. "Get up, boy. It doesn't suit a grown man to lie on the floor crying like a child, especially one who's caused so much harm." Edward hesitantly took the offered hand and stood up. He looked confused, unsure of who this man was or why he was here. "Who are you?" he asked hoarsely. "James Dawson, your father's friend and owner of Dawson Construction." The stranger introduced himself. "Thomas and I were friends for nearly 40 years. He turned to me. "Judith, do you remember the last conversation Thomas and I had, just before his passing?" I shook my head. The last days of Thomas's life had become a foggy nightmare of pain and fear for me. "We talked about Edward," James continued. "Thomas was worried about him. He could see the boy was going off the rails, and he made me promise, if Edward ever hit rock bottom, I would give him a job. A real job, not some handout. A job that would turn him into a man." He looked at Edward again. "Your father," James began, his voice calm but unyielding, "asked me to offer you work if you ever truly lost your way. From what I've seen today," he said, glancing around the room, pausing on Melissa's tear-streaked face and little Jason's confused expression, "that moment has come." Edward tried to speak, but James raised his hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. Thomas was my best friend. We went through a lot together: war, hard times, loss. And when he was dying, he made me promise not just to keep an eye on you, but to give you a chance to redeem yourself if you ever strayed. James briefly closed his eyes as if seeing Thomas's face before him. He believed in you until his last breath. Even when you disappointed him again and again, he never gave up on you. Edward lowered his head further. The mention of his father seemed to strike a chord. Now the choice is yours, James continued. I'm offering you a job at my company. The schedule is tough, the work is harder, and you'll be on a 3-month probation. One mistake, you're out. One tardy, you're out. One lie, you're out. He paused, letting the words sink in. Your other option? Legal consequences. Forging documents, real estate fraud, attempting to illegally take property, up to 5 years in prison, a criminal record for life. Choose. Edward raised his eyes, a mix of fear and uncertainty in them. And if I choose the job, where will I live? He asked, casting a hesitant glance at me. I crossed my arms. That depends on you, Edward, and on the decision we make together. We? He looked around in confusion. Your family, James explained. The people you betrayed, but who might, just might, be willing to give you one last chance. If you earn it? Edward ran a hand over his face, as if wiping away the mask he'd worn for years. I choose the job, he said quietly. I'll try to make things right. There was something new in his tone, perhaps a hint of sincerity I hadn't heard in a very long time. Good, James nodded. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., I expect you at the Maple Street construction site. If you're late, don't bother showing up at all. 6 a.m.? Edward gulped. Welcome to the real world, son, James said dryly. After the Hendersons and the realtor hurried out of the house and the other witnesses slowly began to leave, we held what Henry called a family council. Around the dining table sat those closest to me, Rebecca and her husband, Melissa, Michael, and James. Edward sat slightly apart, like a defendant facing a jury. Henry took the seat at the head of the table, assuming the role of chair. Well then, he began, we need to decide what happens next. Edward agreed to work for James. That's a good first step, but we need guarantees and clear terms. First of all, Rebecca cut in, Edward needs to understand this is his last chance. If he disappoints Mom again or fails to meet his obligations, there will be no coming back. I agree, Melissa nodded. And I want more than promises. I want legal guarantees that my son will finally receive what he's owed. Michael, who had been taking notes the whole time, looked up. I propose we draw up an official agreement. Essentially, a contract. Edward agrees to certain terms in exchange for us not pressing criminal charges. What terms? Edward asked. His tone made it clear he was ready to agree to anything just to avoid prison. First, Michael began, a full-time job at James's company. No lateness, no absences without valid reason. Second, repayment of the debt to Melissa, all unpaid child support, plus compensation. Third, if you're staying in Judith's house, you'll pay rent. Market rate, no family discounts. But that's nearly my whole salary, Edward exclaimed. Welcome to adulthood, Rebecca replied dryly. Most of us spend most of our wages on housing and obligations. Edward lowered his head, defeated. And one more thing, Melissa added. Jason, he's your son, whether you like it or not, and I want you to start acting like it. I don't know how, Edward admitted, and there was a note of genuine emotion in his voice that even I found surprising. You'll learn, Melissa said firmly. Parenting classes, regular visits, and no broken promises. You fail him once, and you'll never see him again. I looked around at these people, my family, the ones I'd nearly lost through my own weakness, and felt a warm wave of gratitude rising inside me. They came to help when I needed them most. They stood by me when I finally decided to fight. I think, I said, breaking the silence, we should give Edward a chance, a final chance. Under strict conditions, no leniency, but a chance. Everyone looked at me in surprise. They had probably expected me to be harsher after everything that had happened. Thomas would have wanted that, I added softly. He always believed in redemption, and I want to believe in it too. The next few hours were spent discussing the details. Michael, being a lawyer, took on the main task of drafting the documents. 3 contracts, he explained, spreading the papers out on the table. First, a room rental agreement at market rate. Edward will pay you, Judith, like any other tenant. Second, a repayment schedule for the debt owed to Melissa, including all unpaid child support over the years, with interest. And third, an agreement stating that any violation of the terms will result in immediate submission of the fraud documentation to the district attorney. He placed a pen in front of Edward. Sign every page. With the look of a man signing his own death sentence, Edward signed every document. My turn, said Melissa, pulling the papers toward her. And one more thing, visitation rights with Jason. She pulled out a separate document from her purse. On the condition of regular payments and completion of responsible parenting courses, you'll be allowed to see your son. Once a week at first, under my supervision. If things go well, more often and independently. Edward took the document with trembling hands. Something in his expression shifted as he looked at his former wife. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't deserve this. No, you don't, Melissa agreed. But Jason deserves a father, a real father, not a ghost who shows up once a year with empty promises. Rebecca, who had been quietly observing her brother this whole time, suddenly spoke. I want to help too. David could work with you, Edward, if you agree to therapy. David, her husband, nodded. If you're serious about changing, I'm willing to help. First 6 sessions are on me, a gift from the family. Edward looked around at all of us with an expression hard to read, a mix of surprise, shame, and perhaps a tiny spark of hope. I don't deserve your kindness, he repeated. You don't, Henry agreed. But you're getting it not because you earned it, but because these people are better than what you deserve. Don't forget that. As I listened, I felt a growing resolve inside me. It was time for me to make my own contribution to this new beginning. I have an announcement too, I said, and all heads turned toward me. A few weeks ago, I discovered that Thomas had left me a secret account, a significant amount of money that no one knew about. I saw Edward's eyes widen, and I knew what he was thinking. No, Edward, it's not for you. I've decided to use part of that money to create a trust fund for Jason, for his education. Melissa gasped, covering her mouth. Judith, you don't have to. I know, I smiled, but I want to. Thomas would have wanted the money to go towards something meaningful. And what's more meaningful than his grandson's future? I turned to Rebecca. Another part will go into a fund for your children when they come. Thomas loved you like a daughter. You know that. Rebecca let out a quiet sob, and David put his arm around her. I'll use the rest for home repairs, I continued, and for the treatment I've needed for a long time. The hip surgery, new medications. Edward looked at me with an expression that showed a sudden realization. The money had been here all along, right under his nose. He could have had everything he wanted if only he'd done the right thing. A year passed. It was surprisingly warm for October. The sun shone with a summer brightness, and the trees in the garden glowed with every shade of gold and crimson. I sat on the new veranda we'd added to the house that summer and watched as Edward set up the barbecue. Who would have thought that just a year later I'd witness such a transformation? Edward turned out to be a surprisingly good worker. James called me often with updates about Edward's dedication, responsibility, and steady progress. He reminds me of Thomas when he was young, James said during one of his recent calls. Just as determined when he sets his mind to something. The debt to Melissa was almost paid off. Edward had been repaying it month by month, even ahead of schedule. He paid me rent regularly and insisted on helping with home repairs in his spare time. Why pay someone else when I can do it myself? He'd say. James taught me a lot. But the most important change was his relationship with Jason. Slowly but surely, it was healing. From awkward supervised visits, they'd moved on to weekends together. Edward took his son to the park, to the movies, to baseball games. He never missed a visit. He kept every promise. Dad said he'll teach me how to drive a boat next summer, Jason told me proudly not long ago. Mr. James has a cabin on the lake, and he said we can use his boat. Sometimes, watching Edward with his son, I caught glimpses of the boy Thomas and I had raised so many years ago, kind, thoughtful, capable of true affection. Today was a special day, the anniversary of the auction, as we tactfully called that unforgettable evening. Edward himself suggested hosting a barbecue in the garden, inviting everyone who had taken part in that turning point. "I want everyone to see that their faith in me wasn't in vain," he said, "and I want to thank you for giving me a chance." And now I watched as he bustled around the grill, occasionally checking his phone. "Everything all right?" I asked, noticing his restlessness. "Yeah, I just want everything to be perfect," he replied. James texted, "They'll be here with Michael in 20 minutes. Melissa and Jason are already on their way. Rebecca and David promised to bring dessert." "Relax," I smiled. "It's going to be fine." He nodded, but I could tell he was nervous. This day meant a lot to him. By 3 o'clock, the yard was filled with guests. Melissa and Jason, Rebecca and David, James, Michael, even a few neighbors who had witnessed Edward's transformation. Henry couldn't attend due to health issues, but he had sent a warm letter, which I read aloud to everyone. Edward didn't ask me to stay out of the way. On the contrary, he insisted I take the seat at the head of the table. He served the guests himself, made sure everyone had enough to eat and drink, and personally grilled steaks for each one. After dessert, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Edward suddenly tapped his glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "A year ago, in this very house, something happened that changed my life. I call it my moment of truth. The moment the mask I'd worn for years was torn off, and I saw my real self through the eyes of the people I had hurt and deceived." He looked around at the quiet, attentive guests. "All of you gave me a chance I didn't deserve, a chance to fix what I had broken, and I'm endlessly grateful for that, especially to you, Mom." He turned to me, and I saw true sincerity in his eyes. "You could have sent me to prison. You could have thrown me out forever. You had every reason to hate me for the rest of your life, but instead, you gave me another chance, and I promise, I won't fail you again." He then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, which he handed to me solemnly. "This is a small symbolic gift, a sign of my gratitude and my promise." I opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized document in which Edward officially renounced any claims to the house and committed to caring for me in my old age. "This isn't just a piece of paper, Mom," he said quietly. "It's my promise, to you and to Dad." I couldn't hold back my tears. So many times over the past year I had asked myself whether Edward had truly changed, or if he was just playing a new role out of fear of prison. But in that moment, I believed the change was real. After the sun had set and most of the guests had left, Edward and I remained sitting on the veranda, watching the last rays of light paint the sky in shades of pink and lavender. Just as Thomas and I used to do, enjoying quiet evenings after a long day's work. "You know," I said, breaking the peaceful silence, "your father believed that even the hardest heart can change, if you show it the true value of love." Edward silently squeezed my hand, and I saw in his eyes tears of understanding and gratitude. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and comment.